to deliver his first message about America's place in the world. Now, occasionally presidents, when they're first sworn in, they'll go to a government agency, sometimes the Defense Department. Very often is one of the first places that a new president will visit for very obvious reasons. The president is the commander in chief. He has a special relationship with our men and women in uniform. But this president chose the State Department. And I think he did that partly because he wanted to signal that the United States would lead in the world with diplomacy, not just with military force. He wanted to send a signal to the men and women who work at the department that he would have their back, that he respects their service and their counsel, which isn't the same thing as always agreeing, but means respecting. After a 4-year period in which the State Department was completely demoralized under the Trump administration for reasons that I'm sure you guys know pretty well. So I think that was the first thing that we should take away from the speech. Now, as to the substance, it was relatively straightforward. I think he put forward a view of American power in the world that is rooted in America's example at home and in our values, in the values that make our country distinctive and unique. He talked about the importance that he basically has said, and he said this in the campaign, every example of our power around the world must be built upon the power of our example. And I think a lot of folks around the president himself, myself included, feel that over the last several years, we have been engaged in a struggle right here in the United States to defend and define our democracy against a very significant internal challenge. We flirted with authoritarian populism in the United States. And in overcoming that, I think we showed the world something about the resilience of our democratic institutions, the power of the rule of law in the United States, which is still more powerful than any single individual. And I think President Biden wants to, in effect, take that struggle global. He wants to take that struggle for democracy and decency and the rule of law and to make it the foundation of our foreign policy around the world. And he wants to stress, and he did in that speech, that whatever causes we champion, whatever interests we seek to advance around the world, we can't do it alone. We have to do it with our allies. We have to do it with and through international institutions like the United Nations. Doesn't mean that we pursue a lowest common denominator foreign policy where we only do what our allies will allow. But in confronting our adversaries, great powers like Russia and China, we are far, far stronger if we can enlist coalitions of countries around the world, whether through our formal alliances like NATO or outside of them, to fight those battles with us. So I think those were the main takeaways. One, return of diplomacy, which is why he did it at the State Department, building on America's domestic example. Everything we do abroad is based on our strength at home, leading with our values, making the defense of democracy and human rights much greater part of our foreign policy as we face off against authoritarian powers like Russia and China, and doing it with our allies wherever possible and not alone.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, you were recently elected to the vice chairmanship of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and clearly your previous experiences make this a particularly good fit for you. I wanted to ask you whether your appointment also represents a good fit for New Jersey. Clearly, we at the World Affairs Council think foreign policy is important, but not everyone always agrees. Or maybe I could be a little more pointed. Aren't just COVID and the economy and taxes and infrastructure, criminal justice, making a long list of things, right, that are right in front of us. Aren't they more important to New Jersey than foreign policy? Why is it a priority for you? Why did you seek the vice chairmanship? How do you think it'll help advance New Jersey's future?
I think that's an excellent question. And first, I'll start by saying the most important issues to all of us in New Jersey are are those that affect us directly at home. And so that begins with, right now, the COVID crisis and getting the economy back on track, and getting the federal government to invest more in New Jersey, for example, our transportation infrastructure. I am sworn with blood to fight to get the Gateway Tunnel built, for example, the Hudson River Tunnel for our trains between New Jersey and New York. And so those things absolutely come first. But take just one of the issues that both you and I just mentioned, the COVID crisis. That's actually a perfect example of why foreign policy matters, because this is a global pandemic, obviously. This is a virus, and it's a virus that originated in a foreign country, China, and it absolutely does not give a damn about borders between countries. Doesn't care. If it starts in one place and is allowed to spread, it will affect the entire world. It's not the first pandemic, it probably won't be the last. So right there, you have an example of a problem that affects the lives of everybody in New Jersey in the most fundamental way, and which is absolutely an international issue. In two particular ways. Number one, we cannot crush this pandemic at home unless we crush it abroad. And so while we worry now about vaccinating ourselves and building up the public health response in the United States, we also have to worry about making sure that we do our share with other wealthy countries to make sure that everyone around the world who needs it gets this vaccine, because otherwise we're never going to be safe. It's the right thing to do, but even if we didn't care about the moral aspects of it, it would be absolutely necessary for our own safety and survival. And number two, we need international cooperation to prevent the outbreak, to prevent these kinds of outbreaks in the future. There will be other infectious diseases, old and new, that arise in different parts of the world. We've got to be working with our friends and allies to detect these outbreaks while there's still time to do something about them. We've got to work through international institutions, including, yes, the World Health Organization, which the Trump administration stupidly left. And finally, you know, I talked about how President Biden's speech at the State Department had this really profound focus on America's mission of promoting human rights and democracy and the rule of law around the world. And you may think, well, what does that have to do with COVID? Well, it's got a lot to do with COVID, because one reason we didn't pick up on this particular pandemic soon enough when it originated in China is because China is a dictatorship that represses the freedoms of its people. And when people in China in the public health establishment there raised their hands to say, hey, we've got a problem on our hands, they were crushed. They were censored. They were prohibited from speaking out. And so the world didn't learn about this as quickly as it should have. A reminder that something that may feel like it's a moral issue, promoting freedom and human rights around the world, actually has very, very great practical significance for us. So that's just COVID. I could talk about a lot of other issues, international issues that affect us, whether trade, we're a state that depends on global commerce, or terrorism, the climate crisis. Obviously, can't solve the climate crisis and prevent sea levels from rising in New Jersey unless we're working with the rest of the world. And then finally, I would say, and this is not a policy issue, but something very important to many people in New Jersey, we have personal and family ties around the world. About 20% of the people who live in my congressional district were born somewhere outside the United States. And you probably wouldn't think about that driving through the district, but it's true. And the rest of New Jersey is even more diverse. So for all those reasons, you shouldn't be surprised that you've got me as vice chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House, and Senator Menendez is the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate. New Jersey really cares about the rest of the world.
Yeah, great, thank you. So my last question for you up front is, we have a lot of Seton Hall students on the call today. including many from the School of Diplomacy. So I'm going to give them a go Pirates out there. Several of them will be asking you questions in the upcoming segment, but I wanted to ask you a more general question on their and other people's, young people's behalf. So growing up in New Jersey, you clearly developed a strong interest in global affairs, public policy, and you ultimately pursued those interests very seriously during your stints in the US government, including one as the country's one of the top diplomats. So my question is really, what personal experiences led you on this career path? What frustrations and what rewards most stand out in your mind? And finally, what advice would you offer to today's young people who want to pursue a career in diplomacy?
You know, I mentioned 20% of the people who live in my district were born outside the United States. I'm one of them. So the answer, I guess the answer to your first question is pretty obvious, that I was born in Poland, and I came here when I was 6 years old, so I was a very small child, but I always had that connection. Traveled back with my family many times. And so I've seen the world from within the United States, and I've seen the United States from the world. And so from the very earliest days of my life, I was just thinking naturally about our relationship with the rest of the world and how important it is. Poland, of course, was a communist country, was a dictatorship then. I got a chance to witness as a teenager going back there the rise of the Solidarity labor movement, which was the movement that ultimately, I think more than anything else, ended communism in Central and Eastern Europe. I was incredibly inspired by that. I could see how important America was to those people who were struggling for their freedom in my country of origin. We were an inspiration. We were an example. We also, through our diplomacy and other ways, we provided practical assistance. And I was very, very proud as a young person that my new country, my adopted country, was able to help my country of birth in that way. And I imagine being part of that kind of thing in my career. If I could help make sure that my country continued to play that kind of principled leadership role in the world, standing with people like my friends and relatives in Poland who are fighting for their freedom, that was something I wanted to be a part of. And then, you know, I did. I ended up working for the State Department, for President Clinton at the National Security Council. I worked for a human rights organization. And so again, I traveled to many places around the world where folks were struggling for just the most basic things, peace over war and freedom over tyranny. And again, I saw how important the United States was to them. I sometimes tell people that in all my visits to refugee camps around the world, where you meet people who are in desperate situations, I've never met a single person who was angry at France for not helping them, or anyone who was angry at China or Russia for not helping them. I've met hundreds and hundreds of people who were angry at America for not helping them. And that's a negative emotion, but it's the flip side of hope that America might be able to help them. We're the only country that is looked to in that way, that is seen as having both the power and the potential to be a force for good around the world. And so again, I just always felt strongly that we should try to be that kind of country, and that it's very much in our practical self-interest to be that kind of country for reasons we've already discussed a little bit. Successes, frustrations, probably more frustrations than successes. So if you go into this business, be ready for that. It's not easy to change the world, whether you're working in foreign policy or as an activist trying to make our country or your local community better. When I was at the State Department, I used to tell my staff that foreign policy was kind of like baseball. If you're batting 300, in other words, if you fail 70% of the time, you're probably going to the Hall of Fame. But those 30% where you've made a difference in trying to end a war or get somebody out of prison who's been unjustly imprisoned, or maybe make a breakthrough looking ahead in in international cooperation to fight the climate crisis. When you have those moments, they're incredibly rewarding because you know that absent your efforts or your country's efforts, they would not have happened.
Great. Thank you very much for sharing that. So I'm going to open up to questions from the audience. And we had a lot of really excellent questions, a little more specific on different topics. And so I'm going to go to a bunch of them now. And to allow for a little bit more of a town hall feel, we're going to have people ask their own questions. So I'm going to have to unmute people. When I do that, I'll kind of give the name and you can unmute yourself. Just say where you're from, your town, your school, whatever you like, and then you can ask your question. And then anybody else who would like could start to put questions in the chat, and I will see if we can get to those in a little bit. All right, we're going to start with Jasmine De Leon. Jasmine, I hope you're ready to go. I'm unmuting you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, Congressman. My name is Jasmine De Leon. I am a freshman at Seton Hall University, and I'm studying diplomacy and international relations. I am also from Bridgewater, New Jersey, so I am from your district. And my question to you is, the country is very polarized today with people on opposite ends of the political spectrum canceling and dismissing opposing views. How do you plan to build trust and faith in domestic government institutions like Congress in order to have stability and build cooperation in foreign affairs?
So yeah, the country does feel very divided.
I'm not sure what happened. Sorry, could you start that over? The country's very divided. Sorry about that.
Oh yeah, I was saying we are very divided, and I don't want to be dismissive of how bad it is, but I'll start by reminding you, and you know this from your study of history, this is certainly not the first time we've been bitterly divided. There have been so many moments in our history when we have been virtually at each other's throats, and at least a few times in our history, literally at each other's throats. So the story of America is one of not avoiding division, but of overcoming division. And that's what we have to do again today. Now, we've been talking about foreign policy in this conversation, and I got to say that that is, of all the issues I work on in Congress, that has been the most unifying issue, where there's the greatest amount of cooperation between Democrats and Republicans. There's still a pretty strong consensus in the center with Republicans and Democrats agreeing that the United States has to continue to play this principled leadership role around the world, that we have to stand by our allies and our alliances, particularly those with democratic countries, alliances like NATO or Japan or South Korea, that we should be a force for peace, a force for human rights, that we should try to be consistent about these things. So during the Trump years, there were a lot of Republicans who were willing to go in with me on resolutions and legislation, many of which were critical of the Trump administration, but we were together in Congress as Republicans and Democrats. And that helps build relationships of trust that for me, I then have these friendships with people on the other side based on our shared foreign policy interests, that help me at least have more civilized conversations on domestic issues that we disagree on. I'll shift a little bit for the second part of my answer, because I think there is something that is very new that is dividing us right now. You know, I mentioned that we've had many periods of division in our past, but there is something that we've not experienced before, and that is a world in which the majority of people get their information about the world through these social media platforms that didn't exist, at least in the current form. They didn't exist more than 10, 15 years ago. And the reason I think that's important is that these social media platforms decide what information that we see, you, me, everybody else, based on our personal characteristics, based on what the platforms believe we want to hear, not based on an objective judgment about what's true and what's important, but based on what they believe we want to hear. And so if you're a conservative, let's say it's Facebook, Facebook knows that you're a conservative, and it's going to feed you increasingly conservative slanted news and information until you're pushed further and further right. If your politics are more liberal, Facebook and the other platforms will know that, and they will bombard you with news and information that triggers your liberal impulses and pushes you further and further to the left. And in particular, these platforms have figured out that triggering our more negative emotions is the most effective way to keep us glued to their platforms, to make us addicted to the service that they provide. And so they intensify our fears, they intensify our hatreds, until we end up with Americans living in completely different information universes, not understanding why there are these other people out there who believe these crazy things, because when we all get on our social media, everybody we see agrees with us. So who are these people who voted for Joe Biden? Or who are these people marching on Capitol Hill to hang Nancy Pelosi, right? It's a very, very pernicious thing that's happened in just really the last decade. And so I think a really, apart from trying to set a good example as a leader and reaching out myself to people on the other side, I think we have to make a serious effort to reform social media in our country to combat this filter bubble effect. And I'm trying to do that with some legislation actually in the House.
Okay, I'm gonna just move on because we have a couple other questions, but I really, that was very interesting. I'm gonna recognize Ari Dibner. Had a question?
Yeah, Congressman, it's nice to talk to you. I'm from Maplewood, New Jersey, just 2 doors down from your district, so just next door. But I want to ask, given that maybe the only bright spot of the Trump administration's foreign policy was the successful rapprochement between Israel and 4 Arab states, what can the Biden administration do to further expand the web of peace that's growing in the region?
Yeah, so it was absolutely a very positive thing. And President Biden very rightly embraced the Abraham Accords from, even before he was elected, and certainly since he's been sworn in as president. Secretary Blinken has been talking to his counterparts in all the relevant countries, including Israel, of course, about how we can build on that. First of all, it's just, one less source of conflict in the region when you have Arab states that recognize Israel, that are establishing embassies in Israel, establishing trading relationships and doing it openly. They were doing it secretly beforehand. Now they're doing it openly. And so it helps to legitimize Israel over time and to combat this pernicious notion that the state of Israel doesn't have a right to exist and people should struggle against it per se. Number two, and I don't want to exaggerate here or get too hopeful, I do think it creates a better atmosphere for eventually dipping our toe in the water of Israeli-Palestinian peace again. I don't think that can be done dramatically overnight with the leadership on both sides right now. But I think, I would hope that President Biden, Secretary Blinken will take advantage of that window of opportunity to try to promote confidence building steps, greater economic cooperation, efforts by the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, particularly the UAE because they've got the money, to support the Palestinian economy and Palestinian institutions so that they're better able to govern their people and to provide for them. and greater security cooperation, which has been the bright spot between Israel and the Palestinians anyway over the last 10 or 20 years. And with these small steps towards greater confidence on both sides, hopefully there would be down the road an opportunity to get back to some of the difficult issues that have been the subject of past negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to hear now from Emma Meadows.
Hi, Congressman. My name's Emma Meadows. I'm a junior studying diplomacy and economics at Seton Hall University. The question that I had to ask you is, under the current Biden administration, will there be more of a focus on passing foreign policy which supports improving standard of living in developing regions of the world? Or is it going to be more of a focus on diplomatic policy, which aims at improving relationships with traditional allies and other world states which have come under strain in the Trump administration?
I would say both, because those two things are not mutually exclusive. I mentioned the COVID crisis, and that's the first challenge we're going to face in our international, you could say, development policy, or at least how we work with the less developed countries in the world, because this is devastating to them, just as it has been to us. Their public health systems are very weak. Interestingly, some of them have done, even with weak public health systems, a little bit better than the United States in controlling the virus. So set that aside for a moment, but they certainly do need help from the international community to crush the pandemic. And as I argued, we have a very strong interest in helping them do that, because if it continues to spread in Latin America or Africa or Asia, eventually, it'll come, new variants will come and threaten our lives. So I do think you'll see an early emphasis from the Biden administration on public health diplomacy with these countries. But again, as with anything else that's challenging, we can only do that with our allies, right? The United States can't vaccinate by ourselves every single person in every developing country in the world. We got to do that through multinational partnerships like the Global Access to Alliance for Vaccines, Gavi, like the World Health Organization, in cooperation with the European Union and with our wealthier allies in Asia. So those two things are, I think, not mutually exclusive, but mutually reinforcing.
Great. Another question from Brett Cohen. Brett, I think I see you there.
Hi, Congressman. Brett Cohen from Short Hills. It's great
to see you.
And thanks so much for being with us today. It's wonderful to see you. So I'd like your views on whether you think we're finally at an inflection point as it relates to the climate crisis. You touched on it a bit, but with sort of extreme weather events happening, so it feels like daily, and with Biden now in the White House, thankfully, and and getting past the sort of hoax idea that climate change is not really a real thing. I guess I'd appreciate your views on whether you think we're finally at an inflection point where we can begin to deal with climate in a comprehensive way, and what sort of big bold initiatives should we be pushing for as a country, and I also appreciate any views you have on what we should be doing as individuals to to do our part in this generational challenge.
Thank you. Well, as individuals, make sure you hold your representatives accountable, because the more we hear questions about climate, the more likely we are to do what needs to be done. And not just your representatives, and anybody with any connections with corporate America. We've got to continue to push our leading multinational corporations, particularly in the financial and banking industry, to make climate policy a priority. We are actually at a point where virtually every major multinational will say on the record that climate change is a huge deal and real, and that the United States should be back in the Paris Accords. We have multiple letters from CEOs of our major companies urging us to do that, which is very helpful politically in pushing back against arguments from the right that climate change doesn't matter. But they're still not, it's still not a priority for them when they're lobbying in Washington. And so whether it's the US Chamber of Commerce or individual large corporations, when they're giving out their campaign donations, when they're spending their 15 minutes with a senator in Washington and they've got 3 issues, like this has got to be a priority for them. The financial industry in particular, and I maybe would add the insurance industry, because they have so many tentacles throughout the economy, and I think they're increasingly convinced of this, their future is imperiled by these increasingly intense climate events. I mean, look at what just happened in Texas. Another example of an extreme weather event that is going to be enormously costly to the economy, in addition to human life. And at some point or another, those who speak for our economy need to be as militant about this as they would be about anything else that threatens their bottom line. And I stress this not because it's more important than the moral imperative. This may not be what motivates the young people on this call to care about the climate crisis, but politically, it is the key to the breakthroughs in policy that we are going to need for the United States to do our part. And then there's the international dimension of this as well. John Kerry was brought back into this administration just to work on this. We got back formally into the Paris Accords yesterday. That's just a floor. That's not a seat. That's just a way of saying, hey, we're back in the game. We're going to need to figure out how to get China and India to do the right things. I tend to think that competition is a little bit more motivating than cooperation, and I may actually disagree with some of my more kind of liberal friends on this one. I think probably the best way to get China on board on climate is not to have an endless series of cooperative initiatives with the Communist Party of China, but rather to beat them up and to say, you suck and we're going to beat you. This is like the space race. The United States of America is going to be the country that masters and markets the technology of transitioning to clean energy. You're not. And let the games begin. And I think actually that would be more motivating to the Chinese than an endless series of diplomatic summits where we all give speeches and make vague commitments. Not wanting to lose, I think, is the thing that will do it. We also have to feel like we could lose, and this is the argument I make to my Republican colleagues in the House all the time. Like, hey, you want China to beat us? Because they will if we don't make the necessary investments and policy adjustments. So I think competition can sometimes be very constructive.
I actually have a good segue. That is a good segue to our next question. So Robert Bost couldn't be here, but he wrote, how much should the US prioritize great power competition with Russia and China? He has in the Middle East and Africa. I might also add Europe and even Latin America. So what do we do? Are we competing? To your point a little bit, the competing versus cooperating.
Yeah, there is a competition. Whether we think of it that way, they certainly do. And both Russia and China, in similar but not identical ways, are deeply threatened by what people in the foreign policy business refer to as the rules-based international order, which is a mouthful. But basically, it's the idea that the world is organized according to some rules, And those rules those rules apply to powerful countries and powerful people, just as they apply to weaker countries and weaker people. Those rules include things like you can't abuse human rights and throw your people in concentration camps and prevent them from worshiping their religion as they see fit. Those rules say you can't, if you're a big country, you can't bully or invade or seize territory from smaller countries like Russia did with Ukraine, like China is doing with countries on its border or encroaching on the South China Sea, and basically saying international waters, that belongs to us. You can't steal intellectual property from private companies that invest in your country. You can't manipulate your currency to give yourself an unfair advantage in the trading system. You can't steal money and from your people and put it in international banks. We're not going to, we're not going to support your corruption. Those are all rules. And the United States, more than any country in the world, over the last 60 or 70 years, helped to shape those rules. And we have very assertive dictatorships in Russia and China that resent that, and they don't want to be bound by those rules. And so they're challenging us right and left. And I think it's in our interest to recognize that, to be honest about it, and to try to win this contest. And that's not it should not be, and God forbid, hopefully it never will be, a military contest. But we've learned from history that when assertive authoritarian powers are allowed to pretty much do what they want with impunity, like, if you allow a big country to crush a small country on its border, like Russia was trying to do to Ukraine, it never stops there. And so it is important to, for us, again, with our allies, working through international institutions, to say, no, these standards, these norms, these rules apply, and somebody's going to enforce them. So I feel, I feel strongly that the contest is there. The question is, do we want to win it or not?
Good. We're going to move on to another student from Seton Hall, Nezar Nakrachi. Hopefully I didn't say that too badly.
Yep, thank you, Roz. Congressman, thanks for taking the time to be with us today. And my question is about human rights, and is the U.S. complicit in exacerbating any human rights issues? I was thinking, how do we fit in the whole Yemen issue, or anything that you'd like to discuss?
Well, that's a good example of a place where, yeah, we have exacerbated a human rights crisis. Yemen is, people will always, you'll hear foreign policy people say this a lot, it's complicated, which is no excuse for doing the wrong thing. But you have a country there that is experiencing civil war. There is a movement called the Houthi movement, which has been competing for power in the country. It is brutal. It is ideologically extremist, anti-American, and so I have absolutely no sympathy for them. But at the same time, in order to stop the Houthis from taking over Yemen, our partners in the region, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, intervened militarily and began using indiscriminate tactics of their own, indiscriminate airstrikes, holding up humanitarian assistance that, number one, have not defeated the Houthis, but number two, have caused immense suffering among the Yemeni people. And the Saudis in particular were enabled in this policy by the United States government under first, admittedly, the Obama administration. Then the Obama administration tried to cut the Saudis off in 2016. And then the Trump administration from 2017 on. The United States provided offensive weapon systems. Basically, we provided the bombs that the Saudi Air Force was dropping. We provided logistical support for the Saudi Air Force, ground maintenance crews, that kind of stuff, without which they couldn't carry on this campaign, and even in-flight refueling of Saudi aircraft, which was very direct involvement in my view. So I think this was wrong. I think it wasn't advancing American interest. We have no interest in perpetuating a bloody civil war in Yemen. I was really, really happy that in one of its first foreign policy moves, the Biden administration cut the Saudis off again. So we're no longer providing any of that assistance to their conduct of the war in Yemen. Without us, they can't sustain it, in my view, which means that I think we now have significant leverage to try to get a diplomatic resolution to this, this bloody conflict.
From Ethan Capstein, sort of related a little, can you provide an update on the Global Fragility Act?
Well, this goes back to the question about our relationship with developing countries. Global Fragility Act was an effort by Congress to try to bolster the State Department's focus and capacity to help fragile states, the poorest, the most conflict-ridden states around the world, build up resilience so that they can take better care of themselves. It was an effort to try to make that the focus of our development policy around the world. It was a good idea and it passed, and I think the new administration supports it. It needs to be resourced because that stuff costs money. You know, foreign aid is probably not the most popular topic on the campaign trail for a lot of members of Congress because many Americans believe that we're spending untold sums of money around the world. The reality is we're spending less than 1% of the federal budget on all of our international engagement. So it's really a tiny amount of money, and I would support a significant increase in our foreign assistance budget to deal with these kinds of things. Again, I'm hoping, I keep coming back to this, I'm hoping that our experience with COVID and the knowledge that every American has that this started in another country halfway around the world, that can be a very strong argument going forward for the United States to support these kinds of initiatives. A penny spent on public health in Africa can prevent $500 billion from being spent in the United States, not to mention 500,000 lives being lost.
Okay, final question from pre-submitted ones from Ben Wager, who's a WACNJ trustee too.
Thank you, Congressman, for coming out and speaking to our council. Much appreciated. I'm from Jersey City, and I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, a couple parts to a question about Iran. So according to recent news reports, the Biden administration is taking steps to re-engage with European allies and Iranian officials on reinstating the Iran nuclear deal. And also today, I don't know if you read this, but Jake Sullivan, the NSA, to President Biden, announced that they were also going to look at starting talks with them about releasing detained American citizens in Iran. Mm-hmm. And so that's a two-pronged policy that looks like they're going to start up. And I was just wondering, what were your thoughts on these efforts, and how do you think they could be complicated in their relationships?
Yeah, well, I support the effort. I think Iran poses a lot of challenges to us, to our friends in the Middle East. The development of nuclear weapons is only one of those challenges. We've got support for terrorist groups like Hezbollah, militias in Iraq that have destabilized that country and attacked American troops, the development of ballistic missiles, terrible human rights abuses within Iran itself. But my view is that all of these issues will be easier to deal with if we don't have to worry about Iran having a bomb. And so just as during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was our adversary, and we tried to counter their efforts all around the world, and yet we still did arms control negotiations, or we still talked to them about keeping nuclear weapons under control. I think it's in our interest to do the same thing in a very clear-eyed way with the Iranians. And so what Biden is trying to do is to get an agreement under which both the United States and Iran come back into compliance with the JCPOA, with the nuclear agreement, which would mean no more enrichment of uranium to weapons grade status, and very intrusive inspections in Iran to make sure that they're not doing anything they're not supposed to do. It's in our interest to have that. Doesn't solve all these other problems, but we're much better off if we have a system in place to keep them from racing to the bomb. And so that's what they're going to try to do. And from that point on, we got to deal with all these other issues. I think no support from our European allies to deal with these other issues if we're back in the JCPOA. And if, as part of the renewal of diplomacy, we can address cases of Americans who are still detained in Iran, then all the better.
Great. So I'm going to move to one of the first questions that we have in the chat. It's from Alex Kazan.
Thanks so much, Roz. Thanks, Congressman, very much for spending your Sunday afternoon with us. You talked a little bit about U.S. vaccine diplomacy, but I wanted to push you a little bit on that. Do you think the U.S. is doing enough to support multilateral efforts around equitable global vaccine distribution, specifically around support for COVAX? Is the U.S. doing enough, present enough? When you think about the overall size of the stimulus package being debated right now relative to the funding gap that COVAX has, is there much more that we should be doing right now?
Probably, yeah. And I don't know the full answer to that question. We're going to have a hearing about it in my committee relatively soon. That was one of the things that the new chairman, Greg Meeks, and I discussed when I became vice chairman. So that's in the works probably for early March. And we have to do the numbers. We have to figure out exactly how much is needed. I've heard very different estimates, how much is needed to vaccinate the world. Once you have an estimate, then you can derive from that a number that represents what would America's fair share of that effort be, given the size of our economy. We usually pay for like 20-25% of these joint international endeavors. I'm very gratified by the initial steps President Biden has taken. Again, he's been in for a month, rejoining these things, dedicating money that the Congress appropriated for that purpose. My guess is we'll need to do a good deal more. One really interesting statistic I've seen is one that suggests that the wealthy countries in the world, not just us, but us and all the others, we've already reserved more vaccine than we need for our people. And I think that's fine. It's good to reserve, more than you need, but it also suggests that we probably can look forward to donating vaccine as well once we have a better, greater confidence that we're going to be okay.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Alex.
So we have maybe five-ish minutes left. I wanted to ask you, I was hoping I could just ask a question, which was to come back to something you said really toward the beginning. We were talking a little bit about why foreign policy matters for New Jersey. It's a really big part of what we're doing here at the council, is trying to make those connections. So I'm hoping you could maybe talk a little bit about any one of these three topics, but they all really matter for the state. One is trade. So how is, what do you think the Biden administration's approach to trade deals might be? Are they likely to go for some big kind of gesture in terms of, I don't know, rejoining TPP or going back into the Pacific or something with the UK? And there's a lot of stuff on the table, or a little more, I would say more tempered, maybe a little more calibrated, maybe trying to kind of solve a few problems on the trade front that are obvious to people, maybe some things with digital trade, for example. So one would be trade and how that might matter for us. Second could be FDI, foreign direct investment. We're a big state for attracting FDI. So I'm kind of curious what you think about the state of that. And then last, immigration, which you mentioned. The state is, I think, something like the 5th in the country in terms of foreign-born population. So it's hugely important to the state. If immigration reform is done well, something, I think people in the state benefit. If it's not done well, it can be quite tumultuous for us.
Yep. Well, on that last one, we were really beginning to feel some of the Trump administration restrictions before COVID. Obviously, COVID froze everything anyway, and would have under any administration. But the just increasingly cruel and draconian restrictions, not just on, say, asylum seekers on the southern border, which maybe people in New Jersey don't feel. We feel terribly about it, I think, because we've got a heart, but it doesn't affect us as directly. But restrictions on legal immigration, on H-1B visas, for example. A lot of businesses in my district rely on seasonal labor, and they want to do it right. They want to do it legally. They've taken advantage of these programs for years, and all that was getting shut down. Families being stuck apart because of horrible policies like the Muslim ban. If you're from one of those countries, I had a lot of constituents who, were where families were just broken apart. Absolutely heartbreaking. The TPS issue, we have a lot of folks all over New Jersey who have been in America for 25, 30 years under the TPS, Temporary Protected Status Program, most from Central America, who've become totally integrated in our communities. They're business owners, they're in healthcare, they're in schools, their kids were born in the United States and are totally part of the fabric of our society. And they were all facing deportation after 25, 30 years. It was crazy. So I think, just the stopping the cruelty and capriciousness of those policies is something that we're going to feel in New Jersey immediately. And then immigration reform, I think that what Biden has proposed, which is basically what a version of the bipartisan, or what used to be a bipartisan immigration reform compromise that has been tried many times over the last 20 years, would be great for our state. It would take a lot of people who are hiding in the shadows and turn them into taxpayers, more consistent taxpayers, and contributors to our communities without having to live in fear. It would make things a lot easier for employers in our state who want to do things right, who want to respect the law. I don't know what's going to happen, but I certainly hope that we can do it. On other issues on trade, I think probably the burning issue is probably China. Like, what is Biden going to do about the Trump era restrictions on trade with China? And it's that really is a complicated question, because Trump was right in a lot of these cases that the Chinese were taking advantage of us on currency and intellectual property. He went about it in a totally ham-handed way. One day he'd be spewing fire and brimstone, but alone with no allies backing us up. The next day he'd be suggesting that, he's ready to cut a deal with Xi Jinping for basically nothing, for half-hearted promises that the Chinese might buy a little bit of wheat or soybeans from us, without actually addressing the structural issues. So I think the challenge for the Biden administration, I have no idea if they'll succeed, but I know this is what they want to do, is to try to pull together more of a coalition of allies, particularly in Europe, to challenge some of these Chinese practices, while at the same time easing up on unnecessary fights with our European allies on trade, with Canada, with South Korea, with Japan, with Australia. We can't be in a trade war with all of our allies if we're simultaneously asking them to sign up to our trade war with China.
Yeah. Okay, we're actually right at 5. So promise we let you go. Thank you very, very much for your time. It was really great to hear your thoughts. Good luck with everything. It's a lot going on. And we hope we can welcome you back at some future date.
This was fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All righty, see you next time. Bye-bye.